meet to form the spinous process. The posterior margins of the two portions are in contact and to a certain extent united, slight intervals being left for the passage of small vessels. Each consists of yellow elastic tissue, the fibres of which, almost perpendicular in direction, are attached to the anterior surface of the lamina above, some distance from its inferior margin, and to the posterior surface and upper margin of the lamina below. In the cervical region the ligaments are thin, but broad and long. They are thicker in the thoracic region, and thickest in the lumbar region. Their marked elasticity serves to preserve the upright posture, and to assist the vertebral column in resuming it after flexion. The supraspinal ligament, ligamentum supraspinale, supraspinous ligament. The supraspinal ligament is a strong fibrous cord which connects together the apices of the spinous processes from the seventh cervical vertebra to the sacrum. At the points of attachment to the tips of the spinous processes, fibrocartilage is developed in the ligament. It is thicker and broader in the lumbar than in the thoracic region, and intimately blended, in both situations, with the neighbouring fascia. The most superficial fibres of this ligament extend over 3 or 4 vertebrae. Those more deeply seated pass between 2 or 3 vertebrae, while the deepest connect the spinous processes of the neighbouring vertebrae. Between the spinous processes it is continuous with the interspinal ligaments. It is continued upward to the external occipital protuberance and medial nuchal line, as the ligamentum nuchae. The ligamentum nuchae. The ligamentum nuchae is a fibrous membrane which, in the neck, represents the supraspinal ligaments of the lower vertebrae. It extends from the external occipital protuberance and the median nuchal line to the spinous process of the seventh cervical vertebra. From its anterior border a fibrous lamina is given off, which is attached to the posterior tubercle of the atlas, and to the spinous processes of the cervical vertebrae, and forms a septum between the muscles on either side of the neck. In man it is merely the rudiment of an important elastic ligament, which, in some of the lower animals, serves to sustain the weight of the head. The interspinal ligaments. Ligamenta interspinalia, interspinous ligaments. The interspinal ligaments, thin and membranous, connect adjoining spinous processes and extend from the root to the apex of each process. They meet the ligamenta flava in front and the supraspinal ligament behind. They are narrow and elongated in the thoracic region, broader, thicker, and quadrilateral in form in the lumbar region, and only slightly developed in the neck. The intertransverse ligaments. Ligamenta intertransversaria. The intertransverse ligaments are interposed between the transverse processes. In the cervical region they consist of a few irregular, scattered fibres. In the thoracic region they are rounded cords intimately connected with the deep muscles of the back. In the lumbar region they are thin and membranous. Movements. The movements permitted in the vertebral column are flexion, extension, lateral movement, circumduction, and rotation. In flexion, or movement forward, the anterior longitudinal ligament is relaxed, and the intervertebral fibrocartilages are compressed in front, while the posterior longitudinal ligament, the ligamenta flava, and the inter and supraspinal ligaments are stretched, as well as the posterior fibres of the intervertebral fibrocartilages. The interspaces between the laminae are widened, and the inferior articular processes glide upward upon the superior articular processes of the subjacent vertebrae. Flexion is the most extensive of all the movements of the vertebral column, and is freest in the lumbar region. In extension, or movement backward, an exactly opposite disposition of the parts takes place. The movement is limited by the anterior longitudinal ligament, and by the approximation of the spinous processes. It is freest in the cervical region. In lateral movement, the sides of the intervertebral fibrocartilages are compressed, the extent of motion being limited by the resistance offered by the surrounding ligaments. This movement may take place in any part of the column, but is freest in the cervical and lumbar regions. Circumduction is very limited, and is merely a succession of the preceding movements. Rotation is produced by the twisting of the intervertebral fibrocartilages. This, although only slight between any two vertebrae, allows of a considerable extent of movement when it takes place in the whole length of the column, the front of the upper part of the column being turned to one or other side. This movement occurs to a slight extent in the cervical region, is freer in the upper part of the thoracic region, and absent in the lumbar region. The extent and variety of the movements are influenced by the shape and direction of the articular surfaces. In the cervical region the upward inclination of the superior articular surfaces allows of free flexion and extension. Extension can be carried farther than flexion. At the upper end of the region it is checked by the locking of the posterior edges of the superior atlantal facets in the condyloid fossae of the occipital bone. At the lower end it is limited by a mechanism whereby the inferior articular processes of the seventh cervical vertebra slip into grooves behind and below the superior articular processes of the first thoracic. Flexion is arrested just beyond the point where the cervical convexity is straightened. The movement is checked by the apposition of the projecting lower lips of the bodies of the vertebrae with the shelving surfaces on the bodies of the subjacent vertebrae. Lateral flexion and rotation are free in the cervical region, they are, however, always combined. The upward and medial inclinations of the superior articular surfaces impart a rotary movement during lateral flexion, while pure rotation is prevented by the slight medial slope of these surfaces. In the thoracic region, notably in its upper part, all the movements are limited in order to reduce interference with respiration to a minimum. The almost complete absence of an upward inclination of the superior articular surfaces prohibits any marked flexion, while extension is checked by the contact of the inferior articular margins with the laminae, and the contact of the spinous processes with one another. The mechanism between the seventh cervical and the first thoracic vertebra, which limits extension of the cervical region, will also serve to limit flexion of the thoracic region when the neck is extended. Rotation is free in the thoracic region. The superior articular processes are segments of a cylinder whose axis is in the mid-ventral line of the vertebral bodies. The direction of the articular facets would allow of free lateral flexion, but the movement is considerably limited in the upper part of the region by the resistance of the ribs and sternum. In the lumbar region, flexion and extension are free. Flexion can be carried farther than extension, and is possible to just beyond the straightening of the lumbar curve. It is therefore greatest at the lowest part where the curve is sharpest. The inferior articular facets are not in close apposition with the superior facets of the subjacent vertebrae, and on this account a considerable amount of lateral flexion is permitted. For the same reason a slight amount of rotation can be carried out, but this is so soon checked by the interlocking of the articular surfaces that it is negligible. The principal muscles which produce flexion are the sternocleidomastoideus, longus capitis, and longus colli, the scaleni, the abdominal muscles, and the psoas major. Extension is produced by the intrinsic muscles of the back, assisted in the neck by the splenius, semispinalis, dorsi and cervicis, and the multifidus. Lateral motion is produced by the intrinsic muscles of the back by the splenius, the scaleni, the quadratus lumborum, and the psoas major, the muscles of one side only acting, and rotation by the action of the following muscles of one side only, viz., the sternocleidomastoideus, the longus capitis, the scaleni, the multifidus, the semispinalis capitis, and the abdominal muscles. End of section 3.